A 15-year-old dance prodigy vanishes in broad daylight. There is no ransom note, no forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Authorities assume she ran away. The reality is far more terrifying. She was not taken by a random predator. She was carefully lured into a trap by a trusted neighbor, a 19-year-old girl who did not just want to end her life. She wanted to physically become her, to steal her entire identity and slip into her existence like a new skin. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the anatomy of this crime, one must examine two entirely different existences running parallel in the suburbs of Melbourne. Rachel Barber was the embodiment of everything bright and promising. Growing up in a household filled with art and affection, she possessed a natural grace that set her apart early on. Her parents, Mike and Elizabeth, recognized her potential and enrolled her in a prestigious academy. She thrived there, spending hours perfecting her craft, driven by a singular ambition to perform on stage. The victim had a striking physical presence, slender, standing gracefully, with an undeniable magnetism that naturally drew people to her. She was deeply supported by her family and maintained a steady relationship with a boy named Manny, who shared her passion for the arts. Her world was rapidly expanding, filled with auditions, rigorous rehearsals, and a vibrant social life. She moved through her environment with an effortless confidence that only highlighted her natural talent and secure upbringing. Just a few streets away, a suffocating darkness defined the reality of Caroline Reed Robertson. Born into a fractured family dynamic, her early years were marked by instability and a profound sense of isolation. Her parents' separation left her unanchored, causing her to retreat inward and develop severe social anxiety alongside clinical depression. While the dancer was commanding the attention of crowded rooms, the older neighbor was hiding from them. Physically, Caroline felt like an inmate trapped within her own skin. Weighing over 180 pounds, she routinely hid beneath thick, oversized clothing to obscure a figure she deeply despised. The frantic scratching of her pen against paper served as the only soundtrack to her nights. Her private journals from this period paint a bleak picture of her mental state, pages filled with venomous self-hatred, detailing absolute disgust with her own reflection. She meticulously documented extreme starvation-level diets and expressed a violent desire to carve away her own flesh. She perceived herself as clumsy, fundamentally unattractive, and entirely invisible to society. This profound lack of self-worth was compounded by a complete absence of friends, hobbies, or romantic interests. Her isolation was absolute and deafening. The connection between these two contrasting worlds was forged years earlier, when Caroline was hired to babysit the younger siblings in the Barber household. At the time, she was just an awkward teenager, but that home offered a glimpse into a reality she desperately craved. Elizabeth and Mike were warm, attentive parents, and their residence was a sanctuary of stability. The babysitter observed this dynamic with a quiet, festering resentment. She watched the eldest daughter, who possessed everything Caroline lacked: effortless beauty, recognized talent, and unconditional parental love. Over the ensuing years, the childcare arrangement naturally ended, but the psychological tether remained firmly intact. Caroline eventually moved out of her family home into a small, cramped apartment, further cutting herself off from the outside world. Her living space reflected her internal state: heavy curtains permanently drawn against the daylight, the air stale and suffocating, creating a claustrophobic echo chamber for her darkest thoughts. Her depression deepened, slowly mutating into something far more dangerous than mere sadness. The self-loathing evolved into a toxic fixation on the concept of physical and social transformation. She began to believe that her own existence was a failed experiment, a discarded draft that could not be salvaged. The only way to achieve happiness was to abandon her identity completely and adopt a new, flawless one. She needed a template, a perfect life to step into. Her mind immediately returned to the girl from her past. The obsession was not merely about wanting what the teenager had. It was an all-consuming, delusional desire to erase her own history and literally become her. Caroline began meticulously studying her former charge from afar, noting her mannerisms, her clothing style, and her social circles. The groundwork for a chilling metamorphosis was being laid in the silence of that small apartment. Caroline started drafting meticulous plans in her diaries, outlining the exact administrative steps required to shed her own name. She chose the alias Gem Southall, borrowing the victim's mother's maiden name, a calculated move that highlighted the deep psychological entanglement she felt with the family. She documented the required physical changes in a methodical manner, the exact hair dye needed, the weight she had to lose, the voice modulation required to mimic the lighter, musical cadence of her target. The narrative of her new life was fully written. She just needed to eliminate the original author. The physical distance between their respective homes was minimal, but the psychological boundary had to be breached with extreme care. The former babysitter engineered her re-entry into the family's orbit with a calculated meekness. It began with seemingly innocuous phone calls to the household. She would dial the landline, offering polite inquiries, testing the waters to gauge how she was received. The parents, possessing a natural empathy, viewed her as nothing more than a lonely, socially inept young woman struggling to find her footing. They actively encouraged their daughter to be kind, to engage in conversation, and to show grace to someone clearly less fortunate. That well-intentioned parental guidance provided the exact vulnerability the predator required. Before making a direct move, the 19-year-old engaged in extensive physical surveillance. Her obsession demanded detailed data. She began tracking the teenager's daily movements, documenting the precise transit routes to the dance academy, the departure times, and the weekend social habits. Hidden beneath thick layers of unseasonal clothing, the observer watched from a distance, studying the effortless posture, the specific gait, and the physical space the dancer occupied. The resentment calcified into a tactical imperative. The delusion of stepping into a new existence required a vacant space. The original occupant had to be permanently removed. The mechanism of isolation needed to be flawless. The perpetrator understood the psychological levers of a 15-year-old and crafted a lure perfectly calibrated to appeal to adolescent desires for independence and financial reward. During one of their manufactured interactions, she pitched the concept of a highly confidential, lucrative psychological study. She explained that a wealthy, anonymous benefactor was conducting deep research into teenage self-esteem and behavioral patterns. The compensation offered was staggering for a high school student, more than enough to guarantee immediate interest. The hook was baited, but the trap required absolute darkness. The terms of this fictitious survey were explicitly designed to sever the target from her safety network. The older girl insisted that total secrecy was the primary condition of employment. She emphasized that if anyone, especially parents, discovered the arrangement, the external funding would be immediately revoked. The teenager was instructed to keep all appointments entirely hidden, framing the deception as a mature, professional obligation. The victim, possessing an inherent trust in the familiar face from her childhood, readily agreed. She viewed the arrangement as a harmless, quirky way to earn money for new clothes. There was simply no logical reason to fear the quiet, overweight girl who used to watch her play in the backyard. Despite the strict directives to remain silent, the teenager maintained a healthy, open dynamic with her peers. The excitement of a secret, high-paying job was too significant to contain completely. She eventually mentioned the gig to her boyfriend, describing a confidential psychological survey that would yield a substantial payout. While she kept the specifics vague to honor her promise, she left one critical breadcrumb. She noted that the study was being facilitated through her old neighbor. That passing comment, delivered casually during a standard teenage conversation, would ultimately become the linchpin of the entire investigation. Back inside the cramped, suffocating apartment, the physical preparations accelerated. The fantasy of identity theft was transitioning into a tangible execution strategy. The perpetrator procured a length of heavy telephone cord, methodically testing its tensile strength against her own hands. She acquired a powerful sedative, calculating the exact dosage required to completely incapacitate a healthy adolescent before lethal force could be applied. The living space was primed for the event. Heavy drapes were drawn tight against the late summer sun, sealing the environment. The physical space was transformed from a depressive, cluttered hovel into a functional, sound-dampened trap. In the final weeks leading up to the scheduled meeting, the psychological divergence between the two girls reached its absolute peak. The dancer moved through her days with typical, vibrant energy, attending grueling rehearsals, laughing with friends, and anticipating the financial freedom the upcoming study promised. Conversely, the perpetrator existed in a state of hyper-focused, starvation-induced delirium. She drastically reduced her caloric intake, obsessed with shrinking her 180-pound frame down to match the slender dimensions of her target. She spent hours in front of a mirror, altering the pitch of her voice to mimic the lighter, musical cadence of the teenager. The delusion had solidified into a concrete reality. The appointment was confirmed for a Monday afternoon. The older girl made one final contact, reiterating the absolute necessity of discretion. The plan was seamless and terrifyingly simple. The victim would finish her dance classes, navigate the city's transit system alone, and walk directly into the apartment complex. There would be no witnesses. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was accepted, and the predator simply sat in the darkness, waiting for a knock on the door. The morning of Monday, March 1st, 1999, unfolded with a typical adolescent rhythm. The dancer moved through her final studio session of the day with absolute precision. Her focus was entirely dialed into the mirrors, the wooden floorboards, and the repetitive physical strain of perfecting her craft. By early afternoon, she exited the academy and merged into the dense, fast-moving pedestrian traffic of the city. The ambient temperature was hovering around a mild 65 degrees Fahrenheit, ideal weather for the walk to the transit lines. She boarded the tram heading south toward the suburb of Praran. Her posture was relaxed. The arrangement she had made for the afternoon felt like a simple, highly profitable detour before heading home to her family. The older girl waited near the corner of a busy intersection. Beneath her signature layers of heavy, dark fabric, she was sweating. The adrenaline of an impending execution caused her hands to shake, which she kept buried deep within her coat pockets. When the teenager stepped off the tram, the visual contrast between the two was stark. One moved with effortless, practiced grace, carrying a small dance bag. The other stood rigid, a heavy, unmoving fixture against the brick storefronts. The greeting was subdued. The predator offered a tight smile, quickly gesturing for the teenager to follow her away from the crowded thoroughfare. They navigated a series of side streets, moving deeper into the residential grid. The transition from the vibrant commercial district to the quiet, isolated block was subtle but definitive. The sounds of heavy transit and pedestrian chatter were swallowed by the dull hum of distant air conditioning units and the wind rustling through neglected hedges. They arrived at a drab, multi-story brick building. The exterior offered no signs of life. The heavy communal door was pushed open, and they ascended the dimly lit stairwell. The apartment door clicked shut, severing the final tie to the outside world. The interior environment was deeply unsettling. The air quality was abysmal, thick with the smell of stale cooking grease, dust, and long-term stagnation. Every window was sealed shut. Heavy, opaque curtains were drawn entirely across the glass, blocking the afternoon sun and plunging the room into a murky, suffocating twilight. Despite the moderate weather outside, the apartment was stifling. The trapped heat pushed the indoor temperature well over 80 degrees, yet the host remained tightly bundled in her oversized clothing. The host directed her guests to a worn sofa in the center of the living space. A small scuffed coffee table sat between them, acting as the stage for the deception. A clipboard, several typed forms, and 2 pens were perfectly aligned on the surface. The older girl explained the parameters of the study, maintaining a steady, monotonous delivery to keep the victim calm. She stated that the psychological evaluation required a completely relaxed physiological baseline. To achieve this, a casual meal was offered. A slice of pizza and a glass of water were placed on the table. It was a calculated, mundane gesture designed to lower any remaining defenses. The teenager, tired from her rigorous morning routines and entirely trusting of the familiar neighbor, accepted the food. She took a bite. She swallowed the water. She remained completely unaware that a massive, incapacitating dose of a powerful chemical sedative had been crushed and dissolved into the meal. The host picked up her clipboard and began reciting a series of scripted, clinical questions regarding self-esteem, body image, and future aspirations. The victim answered earnestly. For the first few minutes, the rhythm of a standard interview was maintained, but the chemistry was already working through her digestive tract, breaching the blood-brain barrier. The onset was insidious. The dancer's sharp, articulated responses began to fray at the edges. A subtle slur crept into her pronunciation. Her eyelids grew heavy, blinking slowly against the dim light. She shifted her weight on the sofa, attempting to shake off a sudden, crushing wave of fatigue. The predator sat entirely motionless across the table, the pen hovering above the paper, watching the neurological collapse with cold, scientific detachment. The teenager tried to lift her hand to rub her face. The limb felt as though it weighed 50 pounds. Panic finally breached the fog of the narcotic. She attempted to stand, pushing her hands against the sofa cushions to gain leverage. Her motor control simply vanished. The muscles that had flawlessly executed complex choreography just hours earlier completely misfired. She collapsed backward. The room spun violently. Her vision narrowed to a dark tunnel. The sedative flooded her central nervous system, effectively locking her inside a paralyzed body while her consciousness slowly dimmed. The facade ended. The clipboard was dropped onto the floor. The predator stood. The target was completely immobilized. The breathing on the sofa became shallow, labored. The older girl moved to a nearby drawer. She retrieved a thick, heavy-gauge telephone cord. She wrapped the synthetic casing around her knuckles, testing the tension. She stepped over the coffee table. She positioned herself over the paralyzed teenager. There was no struggle, no frantic kicking, no defensive scratching. The chemical agent had rendered the victim completely defenseless. The cord was slipped around the neck. It was pulled tight. The physical mechanics of strangulation are brutal and sustained. The predator leaned back, using the full leverage of her 180-pound frame against the throat of the 110-pound victim. The trachea was compressed. The carotid arteries were pinched shut, instantly cutting off blood flow to the brain. The silence in the room was shattered by the visceral sounds of asphyxiation, the desperate, involuntary gasps for air, the friction of the cord cutting deep into the soft tissue of the neck. The dancer's body convulsed in violent, autonomic spasms, fighting for oxygen that would never arrive. The killer held the tension. Her knuckles turned white. She stared down at the face of the girl she wanted to become, watching the features contort and darken. She did not look away. She maintained the agonizing pressure for several minutes, long past the point of unconsciousness, ensuring total biological failure. The spasms stopped. The body went entirely limp. The room fell into absolute, deafening silence. The cord was unwound and dropped onto the carpet. The physical exertion left the killer gasping for breath, sweat soaking through her heavy layers of clothing. She stood alone in the stifling heat of the apartment, staring down at the remains. The objective was complete. The space was cleared. The original owner of the desired life had been permanently erased. The immediate logistical reality of a corpse demanded action. The perpetrator retrieved a heavy, dark army surplus blanket from the bedroom. She rolled the dead weight of the victim onto the fabric. The limbs, completely devoid of their former grace, were folded inward. She wrapped the thick wool around the remains, securing the makeshift shroud with heavy wire, twisting the metal tight to compress the bundle. She grabbed the wrapped body by the shoulders and began dragging it across the apartment. The synthetic fibers of the carpet burned against the friction of the heavy load. She hauled the remains into the cramped bedroom, moving toward a large wooden wardrobe standing in the corner. The doors were yanked open. The space inside was tight and cluttered. The killer hoisted the dead weight upward, shoving the wrapped bundle deep into the base of the closet. She piled boxes, old shoes, and discarded clothing on top of the shroud, completely camouflaging the shape of the human form beneath. The wooden doors were slammed shut. The key was turned in the lock. It was slipped deep into her pocket. The apartment was secured. The predator walked into the bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead light. She looked into the mirror. The psychological threshold had been crossed. The physical evidence of the old life was locked in a box just a few feet away. The meticulous process of shedding her own skin and stepping into the stolen identity was ready to begin. The late afternoon transit schedule operated with mechanical predictability. At the designated local stop, the father waited in his vehicle to collect his daughter, just as they had arranged that morning. The commuter train arrived, discharging a wave of rush-hour passengers onto the concrete platform. He watched the crowd thin out, scanning the faces for the familiar silhouette carrying a dance bag. The platform emptied. The train accelerated down the tracks. The silence that followed was the first subtle fracture in the family's reality. Initial rationalizations are a psychological defense mechanism against sudden trauma. The father assumed she had simply missed the connection, or perhaps stayed late at the studio to run through a routine. He waited through the arrival of the next train, and the next. As the sun dipped below the skyline and the streetlights flickered on, the annoyance of a delayed pickup mutated into a cold, creeping dread. The dancer was fiercely reliable. She adhered to curfews, respected schedules, and communicated constantly. Dropping off the radar was a fundamental violation of her core nature. Back at the family residence, the mother initiated the first frantic wave of inquiries. She contacted the academy, where administrators confirmed the teenager had completed her sessions and exited the building hours earlier. Phone calls were routed to friends, classmates, and eventually her boyfriend. The responses were uniform and terrifyingly blank. Nobody had seen her since she walked out into the afternoon traffic. The boyfriend mentioned their earlier conversation regarding a highly confidential psychological study, but the details were too vague to offer a geographic location. The parents abandoned their home and drove directly to the local police precinct. The environment inside the station was clinically detached. Harsh fluorescent lighting, scuffed linoleum floors, and the drone of dispatch radios. When the father approached the desk to report a missing adolescent, the bureaucratic response was heavily insulated by statistics. Law enforcement deals with teenage runaways on a daily basis. The presiding officer explained the standard protocol, noting that the overwhelming majority of missing youth materialized within 48 hours, usually at a friend's house following a domestic dispute. The parents fiercely rejected the categorization. They detailed their daughter's unblemished record, her dedication to her upcoming performances, and the absolute lack of conflict within their household. They insisted that she had been taken against her will. The authorities documented the information, but maintained their procedural distance, refusing to immediately escalate the classification to a high-risk abduction. The frustrating reality of police work dictated a waiting period, leaving the family stranded in an agonizing bureaucratic limbo. Refusing to surrender to the administrative delay, the parents returned to their house and completely dismantled their normal lives. The living room was instantly converted into a crisis command center. Telephones were repurposed into dispatch lines. By midnight, close friends and relatives had crowded into the space, forming a localized search and rescue apparatus. The hum of a rented photocopier provided a relentless mechanical soundtrack to the panic, churning out thousands of missing person flyers, bearing the teenager's face and a list of physical descriptors. The grassroots mobilization pushed out into the city long before dawn. Search parties fractured into grids, blanketing a 5-mile radius around the dance studio and the transit hubs. The parents physically walked the train platforms at 3 in the morning, the cold night air biting at their faces as they handed out freshly printed leaflets to overnight transit workers, street sweepers, and late-shift taxi drivers. They scoured alleyways, checked the perimeters of industrial parks, and questioned convenience store clerks working the graveyard shifts. The physical exhaustion was entirely eclipsed by the adrenaline of pure, undiluted terror. Every shadow looked like a discarded dance bag. Every discarded piece of clothing on the shoulder of the road forced a sudden, breathless pause. By the time the sun rose on the second day, the urban landscape had been visually altered. The victim's face was plastered on utility poles, bus shelters, and storefront windows across multiple districts. The sheer volume of the grassroots campaign forced the local media to take notice. News vans began idling outside the family home, broadcasting the disappearance into the living rooms of the wider community. The social echo was immediate and profound. The neighborhood, previously viewed as a secure, insulated suburban enclave, was infected with a sudden, suffocating paranoia. The narrative of an ambitious, grounded 15-year-old vanishing in broad daylight shattered the illusion of safety. Parents altered their daily routines, refusing to let children walk to school unescorted. Soccer practices were canceled. Transit stops, normally crowded with loitering teenagers, emptied out immediately after school hours. Rumors rushed in to fill the informational void. Unverified sightings flooded the police switchboards. Neighbors whispered about suspicious white vans spotted idling near the local parks. Theories circulated regarding a highly organized trafficking ring operating on the municipal train lines. The collective anxiety suggested that a sophisticated, predatory monster was stalking the streets, randomly selecting victims from the sidewalk. The community locked its doors, scanning the tree lines and the passing traffic for a stranger in the shadows. They possessed no framework to understand that the threat had never been a faceless predator in a passing vehicle. The architect of the nightmare was not circling the neighborhood in a van. She was sitting quietly in a stifling, heavily curtained apartment less than 2 miles away, surrounded by the discarded remnants of the old life, meticulously planning her transition into the new one. The initial phase of the investigation was paralyzed by bureaucratic friction. Law enforcement agencies operate on statistical probabilities, and the historical data overwhelmingly suggested a voluntary disappearance. Detectives processed the case through the standard teenage runaway matrix. They canvassed the municipal transit lines, pulling low-resolution security footage from the platforms and questioning ticket vendors. The results were entirely negative. Finding zero evidence of a transit departure, the investigative focus predictably contracted, shifting inward to the victim's immediate circle. Investigators brought the boyfriend into the precinct for rigorous questioning. The environment was intentionally intimidating, a harsh, windowless room designed to strip away defenses and extract hidden truths. The detectives pressed him aggressively on potential relationship fractures, secret pregnancies, or hidden plans to flee the urban grid. The boy forcefully denied every accusation. The interrogation stretched for agonizing hours. The pressure mounted relentlessly until his resolve cracked under the strain, and he surrendered the one detail the missing dancer had sworn him to keep secret. He outlined the parameters of the highly lucrative, confidential psychological survey. He explained the strict non-disclosure agreement supposedly dictated by a wealthy, anonymous benefactor. And then, he provided the critical anchor point. The entire study was being facilitated by the family's former babysitter. The investigative pivot was immediate and sharp. Detectives pulled the municipal records for the 19-year-old. The profile generated by the system fundamentally clashed with the standard architecture of a violent predator. The subject possessed absolutely no criminal history, no record of substance abuse, and lived completely alone. Despite the benign paperwork, a unit was dispatched to the Praran apartment to verify her statement and clear her from the suspect board. Officers navigated the drab hallway and knocked heavily on the wooden door. When the deadbolts finally disengaged, the visual presentation of the occupant triggered immediate tactical alarms. The suspect stood in the doorway, sweating profusely despite the cool evening air filtering into the corridor. Her appearance was jarringly chaotic. She had recently taken shears to her own hair, hacking it into a severe, uneven crop, and applied a harsh, amateur dye, a frantic, clumsy attempt to mirror the exact aesthetic of the missing dancer. The physical transformation was underway, but it was failing spectacularly. The detectives initiated standard procedural inquiries. The occupant's responses were fragmented and delivered in a rapid, breathless cadence. She claimed the 15-year-old never arrived for their scheduled appointment. Throughout the brief interaction, her body language screamed deception. She flatly refused to make eye contact, staring intensely at the scuffed linoleum floor. Her massive frame physically blocked the threshold, her hands gripping the doorframe tightly to deliberately obstruct any line of sight into the deeper, heavily shadowed recesses of the apartment. The officers concluded the interview and retreated to the corridor, but the encounter was officially flagged. Covert surveillance was established on the brick building. Missing persons analysts began dismantling the suspect's background, discovering a chilling vacuum. There were no social security footprints indicating steady employment, no emergency contacts, and zero active friendships. She existed entirely off the social grid. Inside the suffocating heat of the sealed apartment, the timeline of biological decomposition was forcing the killer's hand. The high indoor temperatures drastically accelerated the breakdown of the remains locked inside the wardrobe. The ambient odor in the living space shifted from stale cooking grease to something distinctly organic and impossible to ignore. Bleach and chemical cleaners could no longer mask the reality of the decaying tissue. The physical evidence had to be relocated immediately. Under the cover of darkness, the perpetrator engineered the removal. She secured a vehicle and hauled the heavy, wire-bound army blanket out of the closet. The physical toll of dragging a dead weight down the dimly lit stairwell left her exhausted, the synthetic fibers tearing at her hands before she finally managed to load the bundle into the trunk. The chosen disposal site required a 40-mile drive north into the rural outskirts. The destination was an isolated, sprawling farm owned by her father in the municipality of Kilmore. The suspect navigated the unlit, winding highway, guided only by the high beams cutting through the dense brush. Upon arriving at the desolate property, she retrieved a rusted shovel from one of the outbuildings. The night air was freezing, but the sheer panic fueled her movements. The ground was hard, resisting the steel blade. She excavated a shallow trench in the dirt, rolling the shrouded remains into the cavity before hastily covering the disturbed earth with loose topsoil and dead branches. The body was concealed, but the immense psychological strain of the manual labor and the cover-up initiated a rapid, terminal internal collapse. 11 days after the dancer vanished from the transit platform, authorities formally detained the 19-year-old for a secondary, recorded interrogation. The atmosphere inside the precinct had shifted entirely from casual inquiry to active homicide protocol. The detectives abandoned all pretense of politeness. They cornered her with the mounting, undeniable inconsistencies. They demanded a logical explanation for her sudden, erratic change in physical appearance. They presented phone records proving she had called in sick to her part-time shifts during the exact window of the disappearance. Most devastatingly, they produced documentation showing she had recently submitted administrative paperwork regarding the acquisition of a new birth certificate under the name Jem Southall. The pressure was applied with surgical precision. The suspect's fragile nervous system completely overloaded. Her breathing turned ragged, accelerating into a violent hyperventilation. The carefully constructed delusion of stepping into a flawless new life shattered under the crushing weight of municipal evidence. The officers watched in silence as the heavy-set teenager physically folded, dropping from her chair and collapsing onto the interrogation room floor in the throes of a massive panic attack. Medical personnel were immediately dispatched to the room to stabilize her vitals. The physiological crash broke the final psychological barrier. Once her breathing regulated and the narcotic haze of her delusion lifted, the facade of the runaway teenager and the fictional psychological survey evaporated entirely. The suspect offered a complete, whispered confession. She surrendered the exact geographic coordinates of the Kilmore farm. Within hours, a convoy of crime scene technicians converged on the dark, rural property. Heavy industrial floodlights were erected, washing the dense foliage in a stark, blinding white glare. Shovels methodically sliced through the topsoil. The excavation was brutally brief. The wire-wrapped surplus blanket was unearthed from the shallow grave, bringing the frantic, 11-day metropolitan search to a grim and definitive conclusion. The legal proceedings advanced swiftly, anchored by an airtight confession and overwhelming forensic evidence. Inside the sterile environment of the courtroom, the full, terrifying scope of the motive was finally laid bare. The defense attorneys heavily emphasized their client's severe mental decay, presenting comprehensive psychiatric evaluations. Medical experts testified to a staggering level of clinical depression, extreme body dysmorphia, and a fragmented personality. They argued the violent act was the inevitable result of a mind completely collapsing in on itself. The prosecution systematically dismantled the insanity defense by pointing directly to the timeline. They highlighted the premeditated acquisition of the heavy-gauge cord, the precisely measured narcotic, and the elaborate construction of the fictional survey. The administrative groundwork laid for the new alias proved complete cognitive awareness. This was not a spontaneous psychotic break. It was a highly organized predatory campaign executed over months. The state made it explicitly clear that the objective was the literal consumption of another human being's existence. The presiding judge delivered the final assessment. While acknowledging the profound psychological damage of the defendant, the court ruled she was entirely legally sane and fully aware of the moral gravity of her actions. She was formally convicted of murder and handed a 20-year prison sentence, ordered to serve a mandatory minimum of 14 years before the possibility of release. The desire to escape oneself is a universal human vulnerability, but the decision to violently steal another's existence crosses into an unimaginable darkness. The victim's family was left to navigate a permanent, echoing void. They lost a child not to a random predator, but to a neighbor's parasitic envy. The perpetrator sought a flawless reflection to cure her own self-hatred. Instead, she shattered two worlds, proving that a life can never be stolen, only destroyed. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.